Hello everybody, and welcome to Switch Up Story Time. And what book are we reading, Joe, for Switch Up Story Time?
George's Marvellous Medicine.
We're going to read a chapter of George's Marvellous Medicine twice a week, and we'd love it if you could join us in reading this. Should we go for it, Joe?
Yeah.
Before we start, there is a warning. Do you want to read the warning to people who are reading the book?
Do not try to make George's Marvellous Medicine yourselves at home. It could be dangerous.
Very important. Don't try to make Marvellous Medicine at home. Okay, chapter 1 is Grandma. Before we get going, we're going to introduce you to... who are we going to introduce you to? The characters. Who we got here? George Cranky, Mr. Killy Cranky, Mrs. Cranky, and... Grandma, yes. And chapter 1 is all about Grandma. I'm going shopping in the village, George's mother shouted to George on a Saturday morning. So be a good boy and don't get up to mischief. This was a silly thing to say to a small boy at any time. It immediately made him wonder what sort of mischief he might get up to. And don't forget to give Grandma her medicine at 11 o'clock, the mother said. Then she went, closing the door behind her. Grandma, who was dozing in her chair by the window, opened one wicked eye and said, "Now you heard what your mother said, George. Don't forget my medicine."
No, Grandma,
George said. "And just try to behave yourself for once while she's away."
Yes, Grandma,
George said. George was bored to tears. He didn't have a brother or a sister. His father was a farmer, and the farm they lived on was miles away from anywhere, so there were never any children to play with. He was tired of staring at pigs and hens and cows and sheep. He was especially tired of having to live in the same house as that grisly old grunion of a grandma. Looking after her all by himself was hardly the most exciting way to spend a Saturday morning. "You can make me a nice cup of tea for a start," Grandma said to George. "That'll keep you out of mischief for a few minutes."
Yes, Grandma,
George said. George couldn't help disliking Grandma. She was a selfish, grumpy old woman. She had a pale brown teeth and a small, puckered-up mouth like a dog's bottom.
How much sugar in your tea today, Grandma?
George asked her. "1 spoon, she said, "and no milk." Most grandmothers are lovely, kind, helpful old ladies, but not this one. She spent all day and every evening sitting in a chair by the window, and she was always complaining, grumbling, griping about something or other. Never once had she smiled at George and said, "Well, how are you this morning, George?" or "How was school today?" She didn't seem to care about other people, only about herself. She was a miserable old grouch. George went into the kitchen and made Grandma a cup of tea with a tea bag. He put 1 spoon of sugar in it, no milk, and he stirred the sugar well and carried the cup into the living room. Grandma sipped the tea. "It's not sweet enough," she said. "Put more sugar in." George took the cup back to the kitchen, added another spoonful of sugar. He stirred it again and carried it carefully into Grandma. "Where's the saucer?" she said. "I won't have a cup without a saucer." George fetched her a saucer.
What's a saucer?
Something that a cup sits on, so if you spill it, the saucer catches it. "And what about a teaspoon, if you please?"
I've stirred it for you, Grandma. I stirred it well.
"I stir my own tea, thank you very much," she said. "Fetch me the spoon." George fetched her a teaspoon. When George's mother or father were at home, Grandma never ordered George's about like this. It was only when she had him on her own that she began treating him badly. "You know what's the matter with you?" the old lady said, staring at George over
The old woman said.
Okay, with those bright wrinkled eyes. "You're growing too fast. Boys who grow too fast become stupid and lazy."
But I can't help if I'm growing fast, Grandma.
George said. "Of course you can," she snapped. "Growing's a nasty, childish habit."
But we have to grow, Grandma. If we didn't, if we didn't grow, we'd never be grown-ups.
Rubbish, boy, rubbish, she said. Look at me. Am I growing? Certainly not.
But you did once, Grandma.
Only very little, the woman answered. I gave up growing when I was extremely small, along with all the other nasty childish habits, like laziness, disobedience, greed and sloppiness, and untidiness and stupidity. You haven't given up any of those things, have you?
I'm still only a little boy, Grandma.
You're 8 years old, she snorted. That's old enough to know better. If you hadn't stopped growing soon, it'll be too late.
Too late for what, Grandma?
It's ridiculous, she went on. You're nearly as tall as me already. George took a good look at Grandma. She certainly was a very tiny person. Her legs were so short, she had a footstool to put her feet on, and her head only came halfway up to the back of the armchair.
Daddy says it's fine for a man to be tall.
George said, Don't listen to your daddy. Listen to me.
But how do I stop myself growing?
Eat less chocolate, Grandma said.
Does chocolate make you grow?
It makes you grow the wrong way, she snapped. Up instead of down. Grandma sipped some tea, but never took her eyes from the little boy who stood before her. Never grow up, she said. Always down.
Yes, Grandma.
And stop eating chocolate. Eat cabbage instead.
Cabbage? Oh no, I don't like cabbage.
George said. It's not what you like or what you don't like, Grandma snapped. It's what's good for you that counts. From now on, you must eat cabbage 3 times a day. Mountains of cabbage. And if it's got caterpillars in, so much the better.
Ouch.
George said. Caterpillars give you brains, the old woman said.
Mummy washes them down the sink.
Well, Mummy's as stupid as you are, Grandma said. Cabbage doesn't taste of anything without a few boiled caterpillars in it. Slugs too.
Not slugs.
George cried out.
I couldn't eat slugs.
Oh, whenever I see a live slug on a piece of lettuce, I'll gobble it up quick before it crawls away. Delicious. Delicious. Worms and slugs and beetly bugs. You don't know what's good for you.
You're joking, Grandma.
Oh, I never joke, she said. Beetles are perhaps best of all. They go crunch.
Grandma, that's beastly.
The old hag grinned, showing those pale brown teeth. Sometimes, if you're lucky, she said, you get a beetle in the stem of a stick of celery. That's what I like.
Grandma, how could you?
You find all sorts of nice things in sticks of raw celery. Sometimes it's earwigs.
I don't want to hear about it.
A big fat earwig is very tasty, Grandma said, licking her lips. But you got to be quick. When you put one of those in your mouth, it has a pair of sharp nippers on its back. And if it grabs your tongue with those, it never lets go. So you got to bite the earwig first. Chop, chop, before it bites you. George started edging towards the door. He wanted to get as far away from this woman as possible. You're trying to get away from me, aren't you? She said, pointing a finger straight at George's face. You're trying to get away from Grandma. Little George stood by the door, staring at the old hag. She stared back at him. Could it be, George wondered, that she was a witch? He'd always thought witches were only in fairy tales, but now he was not so sure. Come closer to me, little boy, she said, beckoning to him with a bony finger. Come closer and I'll tell you secrets. George didn't move. Grandma didn't move either. I know a great many secrets, she said. And suddenly she smiled. It was a thin, icy smile, the kind a snake might make just before it bites you. Come over to your grandma and she'll whisper secrets to you. George took a step backwards, edging closer to the door. You mustn't be frightened of your old grandma, she said. George took another step backwards. Some of us, she said, and all at once she was leaning forward in the chair and whispering in a throaty voice George had never heard her use before. Some of us, she said, have magic powers that can twist creatures of this earth into wondrous shapes. A tingle of electricity flashed down the length of George's spine. He began to feel frightened. Some of us, the old woman went on, have fire on our tongues and sparks in our bellies and wizardry in the tips of our fingers. Some of us know secrets that would make your hair stand on end and your eyes pop out of their sockets. George wants to run away, but his feet seem stuck to the floor. We know how to make your nails drop off and teeth grow out of your fingers instead. George began to tremble. It was a face that frightened him most of all, the frosty smile, the brilliant, unblinking eyes. We know how to have you wake up in the morning with a long tail coming out from behind you.
Grandma,
He cried out.
stop.
We know secrets, my dear, about dark places where dark things live and squirm and slither all over each other. George made a dive for the door. It doesn't matter how far you run, he heard her saying. You won't get away. George ran into the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. And that's the end of that chapter. That was a bit scary, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. I hope you can join us next time for part 2, which is A Marvellous Plan. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.